नमस्कार दोस्तों, कैसे हैं आप सब। आज के पहाड़ी पॉडकास्ट में मैं आपको अपनी लिखी हुई एक शॉर्ट स्टोरी सुनाऊंगा, डायरेक्ट लैंडौर मसूरी से। आज की रीडिंग में आपको सीधे अपने लैंडौर वाले घर से कर रहा हूं। बाहर अंधेरा है, सन्नाटा है, हवा चल रही है, पेड़ों के शाख खिल रहे हैं। पूरा मूड बन चुका है पहाड़ी गोस्ट स्टोरी सुनने का। तो आइए सुनिए मेरे साथ a short story I wrote many years ago, sitting right here in Landour. ये कहानी मैंने आज तक किसी को नहीं सुनाया। ये इंग्लिश में है और जैसे कि मैं बता चुका हूं पहले, इन कहानियों को इंग्लिश से हिंदी ट्रांसलेट करने में एक तो ओरिजिनलिटी खोने का डर है और दूसरा बहुत समय लगता है 20 से 25 हजार वर्ड्स को ट्रांसलेट करने में। द नेम ऑफ टुडेज गोस्ट स्टोरी इज दोज वर द डेज। इजाजत दीजिए और मैं शुरू करता हूं आज का पॉडकास्ट। Those were the days. Those were the days, my friend. We thought they'd never end. We'd sing and dance forever and a day. We'd live the life we'd choose. We'd fight and never lose, for we were young and sure to have our way. The song played in Kabir's head as he drove through the night. The static from the radio kept getting worse as he got further away from any signs of civilization, further up into the bendy hills. He turned the knob until he came to the first station with music. The radio sputtered as it unwound a new song. Himesh Reshamia, nasal twang. Kabir reached for the knob and turned it to a new station. It was Emotional Atyachar from Dev D. He shook his head and chuckled, then flipped for a new station. An oncoming car flashed its lights at the Ford Fiesta. Kabir dimmed his lights, running a hand through his hair and then across his face. Settling for the Rolling Stones' rendition of Wild Horses, he clicked the headlights back to bright and stared out at the illuminated path ahead of him, searching blindly with his left hand for the pack of classic miles. After lighting one, he cracked down the window and welcomed the wind hissing in his ear. The glowing red of the cherry pleased him as he flicked the ashes out the window, eventually chucking the butt out and watching it light a red path in the rear view mirror as it flew through the night. Kabir turned his attention as best he could to the road ahead of him, trying to concentrate on the sharp turns of the road that winded like a pumpkin vine. He had been driving for 8 hours, stopping only at a dhaba outside Chandigarh, somewhere between Roopnagar and Nangal. Just east of Anandpur Sahib, there was a small junction where he'd stopped for a meal. "You'll get damn near some of the best food in the state," the man with the pock-marked face at the petrol pump had said, cocking his head at the dhaba. "For a very reasonable price, they promise you won't go away hungry." The food had not been that bad for a rundown eatery in the middle of rural nowhere. Now it was just him and the winding highway. Since leaving Una, the terrain had changed from flat, dry character to rolling green hills. The road before him twisted and turned for miles, illuminated only by the Fiesta's headlights. The windshield was stained with dust and dirt, memories of a rainstorm in Mahetpur, and an especially dusty patch of construction 25 kilometers before Ropar. He hated the rain. It reminded him of misery. It had been raining that night in Delhi when he entered the bar. Then the events of the past week flashed in his head, causing him to grip the steering wheel tightly and focus his eyes on the road ahead, which appeared to have been gouged from the hills. The fight outside the pub back in Delhi, the gunshots fired into the lonely night as he ran from the two Israelis in their fake leather jackets, the sound of his fiance's voice quivering as he told her that he had to get out of town for a while. As if in recognition of the pain he had been through in the past few days, Kabir touched his swollen temple and grimaced. His bottom lip was swollen too. It had been a rough night, that last one in Delhi, but he should have seen it coming. He owed them money, and he knew they would be after him. He just had not anticipated it to be that night. He had gone to the bar to meet Cyrus, his dealer friend from Southex, to discuss a way to handle the constant pressure from the narcotics department. But Cyrus hadn't shown, and instead Kabir was grabbed by the two thugs in leather and thrown to the floor. It had all happened so fast. He remembered hitting one of them, the one with the goatee and thick accent, and then getting up and running. He had found his car and just floored it, not even looking in the mirror to see if they were tailing him. Then he hit the Delhi-Chandigarh highway and headed west, driving as far as his Fiesta could take him. He had gone through the rest of NCR without stopping, the sounds of the gunfire still ringing in his head, and the sight of the Israelis charging at him fresh in his mind. And now here he was, on the run and without a place to go. He had just been driving, alone, confused, for miles, a lone figure in the night. Kabir glanced down at the clock on the dash. 3:27 a.m. The road ahead was covered in darkness. Even the illumination of his own headlights could not provide a clear account of what lay ahead of him. He reached for the dial again and tried in vain to isolate the station, but nothing remained audible enough, long enough to satisfy him. Then he thought of Priya, and the way they had laid in bed last Friday night, her hair wet and smelling of shampoo, and him just lying in her arms. The radio then had played that song, the one Priya liked. He couldn't recall the name of the song or who had sang it, but he remembered these few lines. Those were the days, my friend, we thought they'd never end. We'd sing and dance forever and a day. We'd live the life we'd choose. We'd fight and never lose, for we were young and sure to have our way. They had seemed so inconsequential then, just words that made her smile and sing along softly. Now he missed her voice so badly it made him cry, the way she would hum a tune and make him feel comfortable. So many songs she had sung for him at nights as they lay in bed. His eyelids grew heavier. He knew it would be difficult to find peace in the midst of this misery, this cold night that encompassed him and made him feel alone. And just then, it began to rain. The rain poured down on the windshield, and he felt miserable again. Each drop and splash against the glass made Kabir think of Priya more, and he felt alone again, like he used to before he had met her. He was unsure of what lay ahead, and this made him all the more frightened. As he rounded a bend, Kabir's eyes shut momentarily, and that was enough to send the car jerking towards the hillside. The wheels of the Fiesta spun, humming on the wet tar surface. The wind and sleet hit the glass shield hard and dazzled Kabir, whose instant reaction was to slam down the brakes. The car swayed madly and skidded, its steel frame quivering as though it would be carried away by the storm itself. Then the front of the Fiesta slammed into the side of the hill, thrusting Kabir forward into the windshield. He sat there for a long time, dazed and stunned and gripping the wheel tightly. His back felt caught up in a fierce knot, but otherwise Kabir felt stable. There was no blood on his body that he could see, and no pain elsewhere apart from his back. His rear view mirror had been dislodged, and the contents of the dashboard, sunglasses, a notebook, earphones, Kleenex, and a small red flashlight, lay spewed across the floor and passenger seat of the smashed Fiesta. That side of the car had taken the impact, and as he sat there, Kabir visualized how bad it could have been had his side ran into the hillside, or worse, an oncoming truck. Then he opened the door and slithered out of the car. Kabir looked at the wreckage before him, smoke hissing from the smashed engine as the raindrops fell hard on the hot metal. Kabir walked backwards towards the side of the cliff, and then turned away to survey the surroundings. Ahead in the distance, a few lights flickered like diamonds, and Kabir rubbed his eyes. He then looked back down the road where he had come from, hoping to see a truck or car coming up the hill. Nothing. He took out his cell phone. No network. Kabir cursed in the darkness. The rain was getting harder and he did not have an umbrella. Kabir walked back to the car and reached through the window, took out the flashlight. Luckily, he had kept one from his previous trip to the hills, to Nainital a year or so back. The torch sparked to life with a flick of Kabir's thumb. Then he left the wreck and began to walk up the hill. The torch cut through the rain and cast a dim sheen of light through the drops of rain. It would suffice. It was better than stumbling through the dark on this windy, narrow road, thought Kabir. It was getting colder, so Kabir zipped up his jacket. His feet lugged his groggy, disheveled frame up the tar road. Kabir again cursed as the wind howled up the valley and stung his cheeks and ears, deadly cold like flat blades of ice on his rough skin. There were no lights along the narrow road that he was walking along, only a line of trees to his left and the hillside to his right. After what he estimated to be a kilometer, Kabir rounded a bend and saw a gap in the trees, where even in the darkness he could make out there was a path going down. As he approached the gap, he saw a metal board with thin legs dug into the gravel to the side of the road. Lifting the flashlight to read what was written on the green board, its paint peeling and cracked from neglect, Kabir saw in bold, white letters, Valley Nook, the Masseys, private property, do not trespass. He moved a bit closer, casting a look down the path. A dirt road led down into further darkness. Kabir turned around to see if any vehicles were lumbering up the hill. Only the darkness and rain for as far as he could see. He gave the metal board another glance and then began to walk down the path, shining the flashlight before him. The path was surprisingly smooth, and the wet dirt beneath his feet was not slippery. It was not wide enough for a vehicle to descend, and Kabir noticed that there were small rocks lining the right side of the path. They had been placed, it seemed to Kabir, in proper symmetry, half a foot between each rock. Moments later, the path turned sharply to Kabir's right, and he saw ahead a lamp, rather brilliantly illuminating the dirt path, even in the rain. He stopped walking. Then he moved a bit closer. A cast iron gate between two stone parapets welcomed him. As he neared the gate, Kabir saw on the right parapet a sign carved into stone. The Masseys, 1889, it said, in the same white blocks he had seen back on the metal board on the main road. Kabir paused before reaching out and flipping the latch on the gate. The metal was cold, and the latch did not open easily. Kabir jerked it open with some force, holding up the flashlight with his left hand. He closed the gate behind him and found himself standing on a gravel pathway leading up to where the light was coming down. In front of Kabir was a cottage, made of stone and with an array of pottery below the window panes on either side. Kabir checked his watch. 4:07. He looked up at the cottage, inviting and warm during the cold rain. Kabir looked around, but there was no watchman or servant's quarters that he could tell of, just the light bulb burning brightly above the front door. Hesitantly, Kabir stepped up to the front door. Maroon curtains were hanging on each of the windows. He tried to peer in but could see nothing. A few minutes passed by dithering in the cold before Kabir decided that he would knock on the door. He did so, thrice, firm raps on the wooden door. He heard nothing from inside the cottage. Once again Kabir looked back to see if a servant had been woken. He noticed now an outdoor garage, basically a tin shed to keep a car dry in the rain. Where a car could have been parked was empty space. But in the corner he noticed a motorcycle under a green tarp. So somebody should be here, thought Kabir aloud. Just then there was movement behind the door, and Kabir instinctively took a step backwards, his left heel disturbing a flower pot. The door opened, just a sliver, and a voice, a woman's, asked, "Who is there?" Kabir fumbled. Ma'am, my name is Kabir, and I had an accident up on the road about a kilometer back. I was hoping to use a telephone to call for help." The door opened, and Kabir saw standing there an old lady, about 65 or 70 years old, her hair done up in a bun and an oil lamp in her hand. And the moment she saw him, She gave him a warm smile. "Why, of course, my child. Come in from the cold and the rain," she said. Automatically, Kabir found himself starting forward into the house. The urge to follow the old lady into the warmth of the cottage was surprisingly strong. I'm I'm extremely sorry to disturb you at this hour, ma'am, but I saw no shops or vehicles on the road and that's quite all right, my dear. You just come right inside and get yourself dry. The old lady's words were soft, not rushed. She did not at all seem alarmed or frightened by the presence of this messy, wet intruder. You just sit yourself down there, and we will see about getting you some tea. She gestured towards a small dining table to the right, near an alcove with a cluttered desk in it. The lady sat down, the lamp on the table, next to a bowl of fruit. Kabir noticed how bright and ripe the apples and oranges and grapes were, bright like fragments from a broken vase. "Where are your bags?" asked the old lady, her black eyes traveling slowly all the way down the length of Kabir's soaking wet body, to his dirty boots and then back up. I don't have any bags." "No bags?" She seemed surprised. "Are they back on the road? Shall I send?" She paused, turning her head towards the window in the kitchen. She stopped speaking, and in the silence Kabir heard the raindrops dance on the tin roof. "Silly me! I've not got you a towel," she said, turning back to match eyes with Kabir. "Excuse me, I'll be right back." The old lady walked slowly away from the table and vanished into the darkness down the corridor. Kabir watched her go, and then surveyed the room which he could tell, even in the half-darkness, contained apart from the dining table a cupboard, two dark wooden chairs, and a mirror. On the wall were two paintings which to Kabir appeared crude blotches of paint. There was nothing distinct about either. Shifting in his chair, Kabir looked around. A fireplace glowed in the darkness ahead, its flames curling and wavering in the hearth. Above the fireplace was a mantelpiece, and on it were some short candles, a copper vase, a box which appeared from here to be made of ivory. Above the mantelpiece on the wall hung a large painting of a man in a safari suit, a tall, proud man with one arm behind his back and the other clutching a pipe. He looked a regal sort of man, and Kabir could not but think that he had seen this picture before. The man was not smiling, and his big square jaw was clenched tight. The eyes appeared to be watching him suspiciously. Two large, slow eyes in what was otherwise a narrow and sharp face. "My husband, Walter." The old lady's voice from behind startled Kabir, and he turned and saw her standing holding a lime green towel and a folded night suit in her arms. He served in the War of '71 with Sam Manekshaw. He was Anglo-Indian, my dear Walter. Died 3 years ago of diabetes. I'm very sorry," said Kabir. "We each have our time," said the old lady, very upright now. "The question is, will you be ready?" She leaned forward as she let out the last 4 words, and Kabir found himself moving back ever so slightly. "Oh, I'm sorry I've kept you cold and wet," she said, her eyes widening. "Here you go, my child. Dry up with this and then change into these. My son, Timmy, used to wear these when he lived here. You look about his size. These should fit." She placed the night suit down on the table and handed Kabir the towel. "The bathroom's down the hall to your right." Then she walked behind the table and flipped a switch, and a narrow hallway presented itself. "Thank you, ma'am. Mrs. Massey," she said. "Mrs. Elsa Massey. I'm Kabir." She smiled and gestured down the hallway. Kabir took the night suit and stepped down the corridor, turning into a spacious bathroom. His hand reached out into the darkness to his left and found the light switch. Placing the towel and night suit on the counter, Kabir paused to look at himself in the mirror. His hair was unkempt and matted to his forehead. His nose looked crooked, though he did not feel any pain or remember hitting it in the car, and his eyes were very tired. "Could be worse, you lucky bastard," he thought to himself as he rubbed his stubbly chin. Washing up, Kabir removed his wet clothes and hung them on a clothes rack next to the tub in the airy bathroom. He rubbed himself down with a soft lime green towel and then put on the blue night suit, which he found did fit him very well. When he returned to the main room, Kabir saw the old lady had prepared a cup of hot tea. Steam rose up from the mug placed in front of a chair pulled back from the table, invitingly, and the old lady stood with her back to Kabir at a counter in the kitchen. "Have a seat, my child," she said, still preoccupied with something. "There's chamomile tea, a special home remedy for colds and aches. No sugar, though. You're not supposed to have chamomile with sugar." Kabir sat down on the chair and reached for the mug. Above him, in what he presumed was a bedroom, Kabir swore he heard footsteps. He took a slow sip of the tea, which he found to be fairly soothing. As it ran down the back of his throat, Kabir did feel soothed. "Do you live alone, Mrs. Massey?" Yes, I do. Since Walter passed, it's just been me. My son, Timmy, The old lady paused. "He's a musician. Plays the piano and composes music, jazz and polka, in the city. A very talented boy, my Timmy." "That's nice," said Kabir, sipping his tea and looking at the old lady. She reached down and opened a stove and removed from it a baking pan. Straightway a sweet smell filled the room, and Kabir was reminded of his grandmother baking for him as a child growing up in Bangalore. "Just heating up some banana bread," she said, now turning around. "You do like banana bread, don't you, my child?" "I've never had it, ma'am." "Oh, well, then you will love this. I just made it this morning." The old lady walked slowly from the kitchen, a pan of banana bread in her left hand and a carving knife in her right. She placed the pan on the table in front of Kabir, then began cutting the slices of banana bread very thin, laying them gently on a cream quarter plate. When she had finished cutting, the old lady put down the carving knife and leaned forwards with both hands on the edge of the table. "Help yourself," she said pleasantly. Kabir reached out and took a piece of the bread. It was warm, and he broke it in half. He paused before putting a piece into his mouth, but the old lady's smile eased the piece into his mouth. It was warm and sweet and perfect, and Kabir quickly began to eat, popping the square pieces of bread into his mouth. "It's very nice," he tried to say, but his mouth was full of lovely banana bread. Kabir realized how famished he was as he sank his teeth into the warm bread with a smile. Slurring gently as the bread's sweet banana flavor was absorbed by his tongue. He shut his eyes as the bread dissolved in his mouth. The old lady kept smiling. "I'm glad you like it. It was Timmy's favorite." "Does Timmy come to visit often, Mrs. Massey?" "Not so often. He's a busy boy." She smiled an empty smile. "How long have you been living here?" "The house belonged to Walter's family," said the lady, looking around the room. "We, Walter and I, moved here in 1958. We had our honeymoon right here. We lived here off and on until 68, and then returned in 81. Kabir finished the mug of tea with one last long sip. The rain on the roof seemed to subside. Sipping away, Kabir became entranced by the solitary flame of the candle on the table. He did not notice the lady reach for his mug and go to the kitchen to replenish it. Returning, she placed the piping mug in front of Kabir, who, as if in a trance, reached forward without much acknowledgement and took a sip. "It's lovely," he said, purring. The old lady smiled, her hands placed on the table. She watched Kabir sip his tea. "Timmy would sit right where you are and drink tea during the afternoons," she said, her eyes fixed on the young man in front of her, her actions slowing with each sip of tea and mouthful of banana bread. "He was so handsome, his eyes the color of the sky. You would have liked Timmy." "Timmy." The words came from Kabir's mouth in a decided slur. His eyelids grew heavy. A mug of strong chamomile tea and a few more pieces of banana bread later, Kabir was lolling back in his chair, looking up at the old lady, eyebrows raised, eyes half closed, and a little smile touching the corners of his lips. Slowly he became aware of the silence. Silence all around him, except for his own raspy, labored breathing. Above him, in what he was now certain was a bedroom, the noise of the footsteps stopped. The house was quiet. Even the wind that had howled all night long had died. It was then that he noticed, or thought he noticed, something noticeably disturbing about the old lady's face. The shadow of intentness between the eyes, right in their centers. To Kabir, it was in the black of her eyes, a small spark of shrewdness hiding. He found himself squirming, and then inside him there was a feeling as though hundreds and hundreds of tiny bubbles were floating up from his stomach and teeming gleefully in the sides of his head and corners of his eyes. Behind the old ladies, the cupboards were suddenly opening their doors, and the silverware in front of him shimmered in the moonlight and peered through the kitchen window. The forks were now squiggling like little black eels, the spoons quivering like a living organism. The old lady continued to smile at him. One hand went up to the side of her face and tucked thin white hair behind an ear. So what will you tell Priya? Kabir squinted against the glare of the lantern. What? Priya, said the old lady, running the bony index and middle fingers of her right hand on the dark oak table. What will you tell her when you meet her? I'm sorry, Kabir fumbled. How do you know, Priya? The words echoed in his cavernous head. The old lady's hollow cheeks sucked in air, and then her mouth opened. I've been expecting you, Kabir. It was only a matter of time. Kabir's vision turned hazy, and now there was the sound of a cacophony of insects buzzing in his ears. He blinked thrice and shook his head. The lady sitting in front of him rose, gently, and pushed the chair in neatly close to the table, which Kabir saw had shrunk in size. He tried to speak, his voice harsh and crusty. His lips were dry and the words escaped like a whisper. Did you put something in the tea? The old lady moved, glided towards Kabir. He tried to move his feet but could not. He wanted to scream but nothing emerged, not even a guttural moan. A moment or a noise, which he was not certain, brought what little attention was left in Kabir's consciousness to the dark corridor leading to the bathroom. He squinted into the outer darkness beyond the chair where the old lady had been sitting. Who's there? He tried to call out, his voice as weak as he felt. Show yourself. Hush, my child. It is late, and you must be tired. Now the old lady was beside Kabir, then behind him. Her hand stroked his hair, and her bony fingers, cold as ice, ran through the thick backside of his head and down his neck. She began to hum, her fingers in Kabir's hair, keeping tune with the haunting tune that Kabir recognized instantly through the haze and dullness that had sucked him in. Those were the days, my friend. We thought they'd never end. We'd sing and dance forever and a day. We'd live the life we'd choose. We'd fight and never lose, for we were young and sure to have our way. Dee 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 dee. Dee 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 dee. Dee 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 dee. The last thing Kabir remembered was sitting there, frozen, his eyes shut and temple pounding, and those cold fingers in his hair and on his neck. Then he blanked out. Outside, the rain began to fall down hard. So दोस्तों, that was my short story. Those were the days, written many years ago, right here in Missouri. उम्मीद है कि आपको आज की शॉर्ट स्टोरी पॉडकास्ट अच्छी लगी, narrated to you by myself right here from our Landour home. Stay tuned with my channel for a lot more videos and vlogs and stories and narrations from my brief time back here in Landour. बहुत जल्दी मिलेंगे दोस्तों आपसे. Take care, stay safe. जय हिंद, वंदे मातरम.